Colleagues, good afternoon for some of you, and thank you for joining us in this slightly different time slot this week. We can open the week together, officially inaugurate the week together, and why not? It's an interesting way to start the week. In the session today, we're going to be looking at the key elements of a reintegration policy. So try to really bring to mind all the elements that we've discussed in the weeks and the sessions leading up to now, because all of it is going to be feeding into the discussion today. And we're really hoping to have a fruitful discussion with you for the next hour or so. Just a quick announcement regarding the group work. You should by now have been able to access the dedicated space on the eCampus, including the list of components of your group that you should be able to see. And I wanted to take this opportunity to strongly encourage you to already get in touch with your group members, because as you may remember, there are several steps that you need to address in your group or discussion, so it's better to get started as soon as possible. And if you have any issues, either in accessing the material or in getting in touch with your fellow members, please let us know. We took the, let's say, the bold choice to divide the group into 3 smaller subgroups, but if you're having trouble getting in touch with your other group members, we can also do a little bit of reshuffling. So keep us in the loop on what is happening on your side and how the process is going, because we're more than happy to support with any either logistic or content related support as you may need. As I mentioned in the session today, we're going to be looking at the key elements and the contents of our reintegration policy with our colleague Natalia. The session is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the eCampus, as you are already more than familiar with by now, I'm sure, together with the accompanying material and all of the materials for the week. The eCampus section for this week will be open by the end of today. So as usual, you will be able to find all that you need to complete this week before the closing of the day today. And in the meantime, as always, please let us know if we can support in any way. With that being said, Natalia, thank you so much for joining today. Once again, let me share my screen with you all. And let me know if it's working, but it should be working. Thank you, and over to you, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Miki. Good morning and good afternoon, colleagues. So today, as it was already announced, we are going to be looking at what are the key elements and contexts of a reintegration policy. So actually, this would be very important for you when you are working on your assignment, because a lot of the answers of what you need to do is actually in today's presentation. So next slide, please. So let's do a quick recap of what we discussed last time and link it to what we are going to be talking about today. So last time we looked at how reintegration could be measured. We look at the different data sources. We look at field inquiries, censuses, and household surveys. And then also we look at various administrative sources, border control, data collection, tax registers, population registers, foreign national registers. So we saw that there are different sources of quantitative information that could be used for return and integration, which will give the benchmarks for then developing evidence-based policies. Also, we said that returning migrants and former refugees, they're not homogeneous groups. There are some populations within these groups who might need additional support, who might present different layers of vulnerabilities. And this is where qualitative data becomes very important. So also having focus group discussions, In-depth interviews with key informants is very important in order to complement the quantitative sources with detailed information about the specific needs of specific groups within the returnees is really important if we want to have adequate reintegration measures. So today we are going to take a more detailed look into, let's say, what are some of the guiding elements for developing a reintegration policy, and then what are, let's say, the main components that a reintegration policy needs to contain of. Next slide. Okay, so on this diagram, you have an overall overview of the reintegration policy phases. So we always start with preparation and design, then we move to implementation, and then we go to monitoring and evaluation. Of course, I mean, this does not differ from any other type of policies, but now let's take a closer look at what happens at each state of the policy process when we are looking on reintegration issues in particular. So during the preparation and design phase, this is where we are going to be collecting and analyzing our data, brought from field inquiries or from administrative sources, or we're going to be collecting some qualitative data in order to construct the returnees profiles. What are their socio-demographic characteristics? What are their employment characteristics? Because all this information is going to help us understand the content and measures that we need to plan. In this phase, also very importantly, we need to understand what are the institutions that need to be involved, which is going to be the leading institution for the reintegration policies, and what are the key stakeholders that are going to be engaged at each stage of the policy process. And during the last session, also we spent some time thinking of what are the different stakeholders that we need to engage. Government institutions, for example, the Ministry of Labor, we said, together with the social partners, employers and workers organizations, in addition to, let's say, civil society, for example, returning migrants organization could be also important players. So at this stage of preparation and design, which stakeholders are going to be engaged and which is going to be the lead institution is really key. In addition to understanding what is going to be the distribution of competencies for the reintegration policy, it is also important that we understand what kind of resources we need in order for this policy to be later on implemented. And here we are talking about human resources, but also financial resources. So actually what we see is that in many cases, reintegration policies exist on paper, but because there are no financial resources which have been specifically earmarked or dedicated in the public budget, very little implementation is taking place. So once all these elements of having benchmark data, understanding which is the leading institution, understanding which are the key stakeholders to be engaged, and having the necessary financial resources plan, then we can move to the actual policy design. So then we will see what are the key elements later in the presentation in this phase. Once, let's say, we have the policy design, usually it is accompanied by an action plan or a specific strategy, which is going to lay out the specific steps through which the policy is going to be implemented. Now, what happens at the stage of implementation? So in the case of labor market reintegration, as we said before, we can observe, generally speaking, three main scenarios. The first one is of labor market reintegration, where returnees are finding paid employment or become engaged in self-employment, and there are specific measures for each of these, let's say, two scenarios, which could consist of support for skills and qualification recognition. We said that migrant workers and former returnees might have obtained new skills and qualifications abroad. They will need some job counseling in order to help them identify suitable employment, and also services of job matching could be provided, usually through the public employment services. In the case of self-employment, here we can have training measures, let's say upgrading further the skills that the migrant workers have obtained abroad, or let's say training which could address some specific skill gaps that have been identified while doing skills assessment for the migrant workers, provision of, let's say, specific resources. Let's say there could be specific funds dedicated to entrepreneurship for self-employed migrant workers. We know that a lot of the returnees, they have accumulated savings abroad, which they could use, for example, to start their own business. Now, some of the returnees might be going back because they're retiring. I mean, they're really not the main group of interest for our course, because we are looking at individuals who are interested in actively engaging on the labor market. But this group could still be subject to reintegration policies, in the sense that some of them could require some support and advice, for example, when it comes to the portability of social benefits, and in particular pensions. So that's why we are still mentioning them in this diagram. And then the last group is the one which has not really successfully reintegrated, or let's say they're interested in spending only short periods of time in the countries of origin, and then they're, let's say, planning to go back abroad. I mean, this group could also be a subject to reintegration strategy, because these returnees could still need to receive some advice about their migration trajectory abroad, when it comes to, let's say, regular channels of migration, receiving information about specific migration corridors. They could be migrating under specific bilateral arrangements. So having information of such agreement is important for them. So, for example, training measures or specific advice when it comes to the new migration cycle could be important. And again, here public employment services could be, let's say, an important source of information. So the last phase here in our diagram are monitoring and evaluation. So for monitoring and evaluation, usually we need to have specific indicators which can provide information of how the implementation process is going, and feedback this information in order to modify or update any reintegration action plans or strategies. Monitoring should be usually ongoing during the process of implementation, while evaluation is gonna to happen at the end of the process, and is gonna to, let's say, provide information for any new policy reintegration cycles that are gonna to take place. Now, the issue of monitoring and evaluation is really key. You will see that if you look at the literature, there are very few examples in terms of evaluating reintegration policies. But as I said, I mean, for effective policy making, this is really important, and collecting data on a continuous basis is key in order to have, I mean, improve policies in the next policy period, rather than just, I mean, designing them on ad hoc basis. So this is a general overview of the reintegration policy process. And now we're going to go step by step and into more detail how each of these phases is developing and what kind of information we need at each stage. Next slide, please. Okay, so I would like to share a series of guiding principles that you should be following when it comes to the preparation and design of reintegration policy strategies and action plans. Now, the first principle has to do with the actors, the key stakeholders, which should be engaged into each phase of the reintegration policy process. So the government institutions, together with the social partners, should collaborate at the preparation and design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. Now, what are some of the challenges that we see in order for this collaboration to materialize? First, as I said in the overall presentation, it's very important to understand what is the distribution of key competencies among the institutions involved. And again, even though this might seem as something rather simple, in reality, having a key institution in charge of reintegration could be really challenging. Well, because as we said, in some countries, this could be taken up by the Ministry of Labor. In other countries, they are specifically designed, that means in other cases, and especially when we are talking about the return of former refugees, it is the Ministry of Interior which is involved. So having a lead ministry which is going to collaborate with these other institutions is very important in order to start the policy design. Now, another challenge when it comes to who are the key stakeholders to be engaged is that the key stakeholders really understand what is at stake for them and why they need to be involved in this process is not always clear. So in some of our technical assistance, we are delivering a lot of capacity building also with the colleagues in the Turing Training Center, not just for governments, but also for the social partners in order to make possible for them to be engaged in reintegration policy making. Now, we also, in our previous lectures, spoke about the fact that reintegration is complex and there are multiple levels of coordination which are necessary. I mean, the policy is developed at the national level, but remember when we talk about the level of analysis of reintegration, the local level and the community level are really important when it comes to the actual implementation. So already at the level of policy design, there is a need to ensure coordination and open channels of communication between the national level, but also community, local and regional levels as needed based on the specific country context. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first principle was about coordination and engagement. So the second principle is about policy coherence, because reintegration policies are not being developed and implemented in a vacuum. They are interacting with other policy domains: social protection, economic development policies, policies of local development, housing policies, education policies. So when designing the policy, it is also important to see how what is being planned actually interacts with any existing measures in other domains. As I said, returnees, when they come back, they need to have access to training. Their children will need access to education. So how reintegration policies are interacting with education and training is very important. Also, if we look at labor market integration, already there is employment policies in place which are envisaging both passive and active labor market measures. So how are our attorneys going to have access to such measures? How some of these measures could be custom tailored to their specific needs is also very important. So this all requires an interaction between those designing these policies and talking to these other institutions which are engaged in policy development in these other relevant areas. Another level of policy coherence which is required is also linked not just to the other policy domains at national level, but countries often have international obligations. For example, countries have ratified ILO conventions, migrant conventions, 97, 143, for example, but also other relevant conventions. We know all ILO instruments apply to migrant workers unless otherwise stated. So how the policy reflects these international obligations. Also, countries at the bilateral level might have labor migration agreements with other countries. So how is the policy also reflecting obligations under such agreements? I mean, some bilateral agreements actually have specific clauses which are targeting return and targeting return in the sense that how return could be facilitated, how, let's say, the experience gained abroad in terms of skills could then be implemented at the national level. I think we had an example with Spain that we showed in the first lecture that we had. Korea is another example of having such agreements with clauses related to return integration. So all these, let's say, international obligations, being at bilateral level, being at the international level, when it comes to labor and human rights instruments, need also to be reflected in the policy. Now, country-specific context is also very important. Some of this policy development could be taking place in a post-conflict situation, post-disaster situation. So again, in this specific situation, the policy needs to reflect the needs of the returnees and how and the type of challenges that they will be facing while reintegrating in the labor market. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talk about stakeholder engagement, we spoke about policy coherence. Now here, the third guiding principle is really about evidence-based policymaking. So everything we discussed during the last session, measuring in quantitative and qualitative terms of the reintegration process. As I said, regretfully, due to various factors, including resources, data is not being collected on a regular basis when it comes to return and reintegration. Most of the existing quantitative information is cross-section, so it is related to a specific instance of data collection. It could be related to a specific project, for example, but we don't have time series in order to be able to observe how reintegration has evolved over time. Of course, this situation is changing. And as I said, administrative sources are really very promising also in terms of cost-saving solution to collect data. Now, we need data about the profiles of the migrants, about their migration experience, but also we need information about the specific measures which are being implemented, and what kind of in addition to the employment measures, also social and psychosocial support needs to be provided. What is its scales, and how successful it is. So again, this should be part of our data collection exercises in order to make sure that the next cycle of policies are gonna to be important. As I said last time, also maybe there is data on return and reintegration which is being collected, but it is being collected as part of exercises which are not directly targeting returnees. Remember the examples for instance, of the tax registers. The tax registers, have other motivation in mind. It's to collect information on the volume of taxes which are being collected, on the level of compliance, for example. But often there, for example, you could also have information about returnees, also how this information could be extracted. Having agreements among the relevant institutions is very important in order to benefit from this existing information. So it's more an issue of access while the data is available. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have now our data, let's say, in order to design the policies. But as we said, that return migrant workers and refugees are not a homogeneous group and could present different needs, and all the measures could be custom tailored. Now, as I said, most countries already have in place of both active and passive labor market measures, which are targeting their nationals. Returnees going back home, they're also nationals of the origin country and should have access to these measures, but given their specific experiences due to their migration trajectories, they might need specific support. But also we need to say that the institutions, like the public employment services dealing with this specific group, also often needs to receive capacity building in order to be able to service both returning migrant workers and former refugees. Also, in our previous discussion, the issue of having an inclusive approach came out. I mean, some groups could be subject to stigmatization, to discrimination due to their ethnic origins, due to their gender. So also how these factors could be taken on board is very important already at the stage of policy design. And I think also one very important aspect of the technical assistance that the ILO delivers in this area is that returnees should not be perceived as a sort of a privileged group, because this might create tensions with the local communities. So usually when reintegration support is being offered to returnees, also labor market support should be offered to the local communities at large hosting the returnees in order to avoid any potential of further social tensions, not leaving anybody behind. Next slide, please. Okay. Now we have the data, we have identified the vulnerable groups within the returnees, we have information about them. So now we are moving into what kind of human and financial resources are needed in order to address the policy objectives that we are envisaging in our policy. And as I said, many integration policies regretfully exist on paper. They might be very well designed in terms of, having all the right objectives, but given that there are no dedicated human and financial resources, their implementation becomes very limited or is not taking place at all. I mean, usually one way to facilitate the implementation process is to have a dedicated action plan or roadmap or strategy where we're going to detail all the steps that are needed in order for the policy to be implemented and to operationalize the policy goals. So again, each of these steps needs to be linked to resources with specific timelines and also clear distribution of institutional responsibilities in order, again, as I said, for implementation to take place, but also to be able to monitor the implementation process, to track progress, to track any emerging issues, and to ensure accountability of the stakeholders engaged. Next slide. Okay. This guiding principle is really focusing on the return migration development nexus and how the returnees could be contributing to the development of their home countries. As we said, they are bringing valuable skills and experiences abroad, but they're not automatically translated into the local labor market. I mean, as we said, returnees should also be kind of active in trying to identify their own employment opportunities, which of course could take place through the social networks they're already engaged with, but also they are public institutions like the employment services, both public and also private, which could facilitate this process. So when it comes to capitalizing on the skills and experiences gained abroad, employment services could provide information and facilitate this process, but they themselves do not have the competencies to recognize the skills. So actually directing the migrant workers towards the designated national institutions is very important in order for the recognition process to take place. Then once the recognition process has taken place, employment services have very important role in terms of providing additional training which is needed in order to acquire the necessary skills at the required level by the labor market, providing assistance for job search, career counseling. So these are all support measures which needs to be detailed in your strategy so that these groups then could access them during the implementation process. As we said, employment support is important, but many of the returnees engage in entrepreneurial activities through self-employment. So also having specific packages to help them is really important. During the post COVID period, we saw that many origin countries were trying to offer such packages, but the challenge has been that the same package is offered to everybody. And of course, you can imagine that this could be very challenging because, let's say, not every return migrant worker, for example, we need a sewing machine. Some of them may be interested in engaging with other sectors like agriculture, or I don't know, starting a business in the hotel and restaurant sector. So really thinking through how different needs could be properly addressed rather than giving the same package to each returnees is not always, let's say, the winning solution. Next slide, please. Okay, so the West guiding principle is the one on the gender consideration that they should be mainstreamed. So it is very important that, gender concerns are taken at the level of the design already, but then in the action plan, in the strategy of implementation, also it is clearly indicated how these different needs are gonna to be addressed. And again, as I said, at the level of monitoring and evaluation, we will need to have a gender disaggregated indicators which are gonna to help us track progress and see how these groups are faring on the labor market in order to be able to realign, if needed, the measures while designing the new cycle of policies. Next slide, please. Okay, so I would like to pause a little bit and have a discussion around this process of policy design. So I have here put some questions about, let's say, what are the core data and information when we need to design policies, how we can identify the local factors which influence the reintegration process, and what are the key components that we should be considering when designing comprehensive reintegration policies. This is just to guide our discussion, but I'm seeing that already there were some questions in the chat. So I will try to also use this time to address some of the issues that that you're raising. Yeah, so I'll ask Michela to help me manage
Of
the
course.
discussion.
Thank you, Natalia. Maybe we can start with the questions in the chat because a few of them have been there for a little while already. So maybe we can start from there and then we can move into the discussion, bringing the participants in as well and hearing from them what they think. The first one is that we got, and I'm going in chronological order of when we have received them. And the first one is from Yannick asking, can remigration be considered as a failure of the reintegration process, or is this something slightly different that we're looking at in this context? Would you like me to bring up a few together, or do you want to go one by one?
Yes, please. I think let's take a few questions because I saw that already there were a couple of them.
Indeed. So the next question is more to do with terminology and clarifying exactly what we're talking about. So Sophie is asking what distinguishes a reintegration program from a reintegration policy. So clarifying a bit the distinction. And then we have two more questions that are potentially a little bit more complex. So I might let you address these two first, and then we go to the other two slightly later. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is if remigration is a failure. I would say no. Why? Because some migrant workers might be coming back with the idea to spend shorter periods of time in their origin country. They still need to have some support when it comes to labor market integration because they will need to have some subsistence in order to to live in the country, but then they plan to go back abroad. I mean, we are increasingly observing that temporary migration, temporary labor migration schemes are implemented, especially in sectors which require seasonal labor, agriculture or construction. So actually, being engaged in multiple spans of migration could also be important when it comes to this discourse of what is the return migration and development nexus. Because, as I said, even if you're spending repeated short periods of time abroad, returnees could still be able to contribute to the local economy with their skills, with their savings. So the fact that they're engaging in circular migration does not necessarily mean that we have a reintegration failure, because it really also it depends on the personal objectives of individuals, of how how they want to reintegrate and what opportunities are out there. But I think for both these groups, those who are planning to stay long term in the origin countries and those who are remigrating, there is a need to provide support services in order to benefit from the migration process, both at the individual level, but also at the country level. So I would not say that necessarily remigration is also resulting in a failure. Sometimes it might also result in a failure. I mean, if migrant workers are not able to find employment, there again, there could be different scenarios. It could be the economic context, the weak labor demand, which is the case in many origin countries. But also it could be the lack of services which are being provided. Then I think, again, it would be more a failure of the policy process to provide support for these specific groups. But I think it's very difficult to generalize and say, well, remigration is a failure all the time. No, I would not say so. Now let me move to the question on reintegration program versus reintegration policy. Okay. So reintegration policies is where we have our policy objectives. So what we're going to do with the reintegration process. And Also there we have indicated which institutions are responsible, like what is the distribution of competencies when it comes to reintegration. And also there are resources which are being used for reintegration. Now, once we have the policy, we need to have a tool which is gonna have to facilitate the implementation. So this policy very often is accompanied by an action plan, or it could also be called a strategy, which then is gonna to detail the steps of how our objectives are gonna to be translated into concrete actions, into concrete measures. And then ideally, each of these measures needs to be time bound and a dedicated resources also indicated. So, and then if we go to a third level of detail, we can have specific programs and specific measures targeting returnees. Like for example, we are gonna to have training measures implemented by the public employment services for returning migrant workers and former refugees. This is a specific program, specific employment program run by the public employment services targeting refugees. So in the policy, in general, we are going to have an objective of labor market reintegration of returnees and enhancing their skills. In the action plan, we are gonna to have indicated that public employment services are gonna to be running active labor market measures, specifically targeting returnees. And then as part of the active measures, we're going to have a specific reintegration program, which is going to be targeting returnees, providing skills upgrades, I don't know, in different sectors. So these are, let's say, different levels of, the first one is gonna to be at the strategic level, at the overall policy level, and then the action plan and the program are gonna to represent the policy implementation. So I hope this clarifies.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for the clarification, but also for the points about remigration. The follow-up question, so the following questions, there's two. One that's again from Yannick asking, are there guidelines that inform the development of reintegration policies or programs that are tailored to specific contexts? And he is mentioning specifically the post-crisis, but also the post-disaster situation. So I'll let you maybe react to this, but I might also add something towards the end. And then taking two together again, there's another question from Carmen asking, after how long is a person no longer considered a returnee? So is there a criteria to show that a person is no longer considered a returnee, maybe after a few years without remigrating, maybe other types of considerations? And should this be made clear in the development and in the implementation of the policy? Thank you, and over to you. Natalia, you're muted, sorry.
Okay, so now I'm first looking into the specific context. I mean, the ILO guidelines on reintegration are of a generic nature. So then they could be adapted to the specific needs. For example, we have adapted them to the context of Southeast Asia. We had a project in the post-COVID context. So you take the generic guidelines and then in very close consultation and collaboration with the local key stakeholders, these guidelines were adapted. So the idea is that we provide a general frame, and then in collaboration with the country, those guidelines could be updated. About the specific context, for example, of a post-conflict situation, I mean, you'll have the opportunity, I think, during the next session to talk to the colleagues of UNHCR, and indeed they have developed a dedicated handbook, which I understand is currently up under update and will be published very soon, where you have specific guidelines when it comes to reintegration in post-conflict scenarios. So let's say the ILO guidelines are more generic to be adapted to the national context, while, for example, in the case of former refugees, UNHCR has developed indeed specific guidelines. Now, the second question was about the timing and when you stop being a returnee. You know, this goes back to our discussion of the definitions. And remember how we said that there is no really universal definition. I mean, when it comes to the usual residents of that migrant workers are spending now in their origin country. The standard statistical definition is 12 months, right? You need to spend at least 12 months in the country. But as I said, since returnees very often engage in circular migration, if you look at the ILO guidelines on measuring labor migration statistics, we have indicated between 6 months and 5 years. So there is no universal rule. I mean, this is really up to the country. You know, some countries might face a lot of circular migration, a lot of cross-border migration, which might be taking place even on daily basis, you know, just people crossing the border and going to work in another country. So then the definition should be also reflecting this, this specific timing. So again, it's based on the specific needs, and there is no universal rule about the period of time that you need to include. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Natalia. And indeed, going back to the question from Yannick about the specific guidelines and the point that you raised about UNHCR and the guideline that UNHCR has developed specifically for returning refugees. This is something that we're also going to discuss in a little bit more detail during the session on Thursday. So coming up this week, looking at different implementation experiences, I would say, where we will have one speaker from the ILO and one speaker from UNHCR, really highlighting a bit the differences in approach and the specificities of the approach when we're looking at these two specific target groups. So this is something that we're going to explore in a little bit more detail in the rest of the week. Now, going back to the questions that Natalia, you have prepared for our participants on the other side. So flipping the script a little bit and trying to hear from our colleagues who have joined us today. The first question is, what is the core data or core information that is essential for shaping reintegration policies for returnees and former refugees? How can we identify local factors that influence successful reintegration outcomes? And what are some key components that should be included in a comprehensive reintegration policy for returning migrants and former refugees? So I'm opening the floor for discussion. Please feel free to raise your hand or take the floor directly, since we're a relatively small group. Otherwise, if you're more comfortable in writing in the chat, please also feel free to write in the chat and we can give you the floor. But I see that we have two raised hands, Janatul and Sophie. So Janatul, over to you, and then Sophie. Thank you. Yes, you were
Nikki,
still muted.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. So for the first question, I think returning and refugee data basically is important. And then there should be need assessment, especially the emergency needs, and then short-term needs and long-term needs assessment. And for the second question, as far as I understand, I think local factors could be, for example, whether there is any national reintegration or refugee policy or not, or are there any guideline how they will be integrated in the society? I mean, the returnees or the refugees. Uh, and another thing should be, I guess, like if there is any systematic development for the reintegration of the returnees, uh, for example, like if there is any infrastructural development, or if there is any legal mechanisms to resettle them in the home country. And most of all, I believe for the successful reintegration, there should be effective opportunities for the regular migrants. For example, if there is effective migration policy, a cohesive migration policy, and the migration governance system, then the reintegration process could be more successful uh, than if there is absence of proper migration policy. And for the third, I think there should be structural components. For example, whether there are job placement opportunities, whether there are investment opportunities, or whether there are social protection or social cohesion measures. So from my side, that's all. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for sharing, Janatul. Let me pass the floor now to Sophie, and then we can take some reactions, initial reactions from Natalia. Sophie, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, and greetings to all. Okay, regarding the first question on data, what core data are essential for shaping reintegration policies? I think, for instance, the profiles of returnees, whereby we highlight their age, their gender, their education, as well as their skills, as well as their migratory history and their vulnerabilities. We have to be able to know how they are vulnerable in different ways so that we'll be able to address their vulnerabilities separately. Also, we have to think about institutional mapping, whereby existing actors and programs supporting reintegration policy is highlighted, and each actor knows exactly what role to play. I think also regarding the same question, we have to think about the migration trends, how frequent the migration is. If, for instance, those coming back, are they coming back voluntarily or forced or just spontaneous returns? Regarding question 2, I think we have to look at the community consultations. We know that migration is to be able to address most labor migration problems and migration in general, we have to use a whole of government approach as well as a whole of society approach. So here we have to be able to engage local authorities, civil society organizations, employment organizations, workers organizations. We have to also be able to assess the employment needs of the community and the opportunities that exist already to be able to better fit in the returnees into such opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much for sharing. And then I'm picking up one additional comment that I see in the chat from Kamal, who is reinforcing the points that were already raised by colleagues, saying data needed is linked to the detailed information, including the number of returnees, their skill status, their experiences, and their resources. And then in terms of local factors, is expanding also saying policy space, but also employment opportunities, engagement of stakeholders, and specific program and monitoring as well. So based on these initial responses, Natalia, over to you for maybe a quick reaction.
Yes, I mean, I would like to thank the colleagues for raising all these very important points, and all of them are absolutely pertinent. What I would like to put further emphasis is on this issue of assessing the employment needs of the community. And I think this is really where we see in many places to have considerable challenges. because even in situations where there are some reintegration measures which are open to the general population, when it comes to the returnees, the access is really not feasible. And here, for example, I will give you the story of returnees in the post-COVID who are offered entrepreneurial support measures. But let's say the access to capital was very expensive. So for them, it was not feasible to access it. And even though, let's say, governments in certain countries were providing such measures, due to lack of collateral and due to the cost of the credit, returnees were not able to access it. Then also, the access to financial resources were not supported by packages of entrepreneurship training. So in a way, even though there were some measures out there, given that, they were not well targeted and not well thought through in terms of all activities, even though a lot of resources maybe were invested by the government, then the actual impact on the ground was very limited. So that's why this assessment of the employment needs of communities and what is really feasible is very important in order to design measures which work. So I would really like to emphasize this. Over to you, Miki.
Thank you. I don't have any other comments to pick up from the chat, and I don't have any other raise. There is one, just as I was saying. So Ernestina is contributing in the chat, and she's saying, in terms of local factors, I think there is a need to identify migration hotspots to explore factors influencing migration. Also, there is a need to identify resources that could support returnees' social and economic livelihoods. And also, it is important to identify organizations, institutions, and facilities that deal with returnees and migrants in general to ensure that returnees have access to reliable resources to facilitate their reintegration. So all valid points here as well. I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add or specify, Natalia.
No, I mean, again, I think the reaction from Ernestina is highlighting the role of local communities because this is where the reintegration is taking place. This is where the measures are being implemented. So actually offering support both for the returnees and the local communities at large hosting them is very important also to avoid any local tension, because as I said, in some of our technical assistance, we saw that when there was a mass return after COVID, a lot of the local communities felt pressure that, there was a need to help the returnees, but those communities themselves had also their own needs and challenges. So having feasible measures addressing the needs of everybody is really key in order to maintain social cohesion while facilitating the integration process. Okay, so I suggest that we move forward. So let's go to the next slide. So now this part of my presentation is really gonna to focus on what are the different sections that a reintegration policy needs to include. So it's very close to the assignment that you're working on. Of course, I'm gonna to present to you a generalized version. Again, depending on the specific country needs and situations, these sections could be adapted, but let's say I will show you the main building blocks that you need to consider when developing an integration policy. And of course, what I'm going to say now is not going to be really new because it is linked to all the guiding principles and all the previous discussions that we had about the need for evidence, the different layer of analysis, and the different type of stakeholders that we need to engage. Now, this slide is doing a recap of what are the key informations that we need in order to embark on the reintegration policy design. So we need to map the existing legal frameworks in terms of any laws or regulations on return and reintegration, governance related to distribution of competencies of the different institutions, the labor market data we need, both on the supply and the demand side, and also what are the vacancies which are available that the returnees could have access to. We said also that our policies need to be coherent with any international obligations that countries have in terms of human and labor rights instruments, but also in terms of any bilateral or multilateral agreements that have been signed which contain clauses on return. Then we also need to have information about the active labor market measures that are there, I mean, both active and passive, and how they could provide reintegration support. What are the arrangement of skill recognition that exists at the national level and how returnees could access them? And of course, we need to have gender disaggregated information in order to address any vulnerabilities they might have. And last but not least, we need to have a budget, a dedicated budget in order for the policy then to be implemented. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first section or the first heading of our integration policies needs to look into who are our returnees, what are their socioeconomic profiles, and again, here we are going to looking at the data coming from the national statistical offices or any academic research or studies that have been done. In some cases, if very limited information is available, ad hoc data collection exercises could be organized within the resources available, and targeted surveys could be conducted in order to understand who are returnees. Of course, all of this is going to be subject to available human and financial resources. But this is going to provide the benchmark information for understanding of our target group. Next slide, please. Now, another key heading is what are our policy objectives and priorities for labor market reintegration. And as we said, for labor market reintegration, in order to be successful, we need to have a comprehensive package of services, a comprehensive approach. So we are going to be focusing on employment measures, but also we need to give access to education, we need to give access to housing, we need to give access to psychosocial support, we need to facilitate the portability of social benefits. So all these different types of reintegration needs to be reflected in our policy objectives in order for reintegration to take place. And this needs to be included in this part on main objectives and priorities of the reintegration process. Next slide, please. Now, the other key building block of our policy is the institutional framework, including accountability and including resource obligation. So here we need to specify what is the legal and administrative framework that are going to apply, what are the institutional roles, so clarify who is responsible for what and how these different players are gonna to engage into the reintegration process. And then we are gonna to have our human and financial resources that are needed in order for the implementation to take place. Next slide, please. Now, this part is gonna to be focusing on what are the concrete measures and what are the concrete steps in order for the policy implementation to take place. And usually this part is gonna to be described in an accompanying strategy or into an accompanying action plan, which are gonna to be outlining the measures or the programs that are gonna to be implemented for the returnee. So basically, the action plan or the strategy is gonna to describe how implementation is gonna to take place. Next slide. Okay, so our final building block is on monitoring and evaluation. And as I said, this is really key to have monitoring indicators to accompany the process of implementation. This is the only way for us to understand if our measures are providing the necessary support, if they're successfully reaching out the target group. As I said, again, this is something which is not often taking place. I mean, measures are being implemented, but there is no feedback loop which is being inserted in the policy. So in turn, I mean, this often has an impact then when it comes to designing a generation, a new cycle of policies and making sure that they're better, that they're more effective in terms of targeting, but also in terms of cost efficiency as well. So that's why having monitoring and evaluation indicators is really key. And in this process also, engaging with the right stakeholders is also very important. I mean, on one hand are the government institutions, but also the role of social partners is very important in all phases of the monitoring and evaluation process in order to be in a position to track progress, to measure impact, and as I said, to provide feedback to the next cycle of policies. And I mean, as Miki said at the beginning, there will be a dedicated session to monitoring and evaluation in one of the next lectures. So I will stop here and then take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. We still have about 10 minutes left in the session today to see if there are any questions from the participants. And there is indeed one question, apologies, from Sophie. Sophie, would you like to take the floor and read your question, or would you like me to read it? Both are fine, but if you can.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Let me read it. So I would like to know what funding models or partnerships can support a long-term reintegration initiative. This is because we noticed during monitoring and evaluation that funding is usually a problem to ensure sustainable reintegration. So I would like to know what is the solution apart from just funding models to know and support a long-term reintegration process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Natalia, over to you if you can hear us, because I see you have.
I think I have some problems. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. So basically, I think the stage of profiling of your returnees is very important, because this is where you're going to understand if they're interested in having a longer term stay in their home country and long-term reintegration, as opposed to those returnees who are going to be engaging in circular migration, or let's say repeated periods of temporary movement. So that's why I think the initial profiling, which is often done by public employment services, is very important, because then based on this information and also on the information with the social
We lost you, Natalia, for a moment. I think she is disconnected. Marion, do you confirm we don't have her anymore? No, there was a connection issue.
Yes, I do
Thank
confirm.
you.
I think, sorry, you cannot see me, but
No worries.
I see you. Okay, yes, I confirm she's not connected, but I suppose she will reconnect in seconds probably. She had said our connection was not
Was a
very
little bit
stable today.
unstable.
Mm.
Yes, so I don't want to okay, perhaps while we wait, Sophia, and thank you for your patience in maybe waiting for Natalia to come back if she manages. We can see if there are any other questions that are linked potentially to the group work or to the course material and structure and so on. And I will let Natalia get back when she gets back, complete her answer, 'cause she was stopped mid-sentence to her answer on funding models.
Yes, I think we should encourage the participants to take the opportunity to ask the questions about the group work, because it's definitely the good time to do so. And also I wanted to remind, if you didn't access the campus, it's really time to do so now. Otherwise you cannot even see the instructions of the group work.
Indeed. So do let us know if we can support. And in the meantime, I don't see Natalia connecting. So maybe we can wait a couple extra minutes if everyone is in agreement to see if she's able to come back. Otherwise, we can maybe park the question for now. We will keep it on our records and then get back to you, Sophie, on this specific issue, either via the weekly forum or during the next time, the next moment when Natalia is online with us. As I mentioned in the session on Thursday, we will have two speakers. One is our colleague Ida Owl, who is Chief Technical Advisor for the Better Regional Migration Management Project in East Africa, and she's going to be sharing with us her experience on the reintegration of Ethiopian migrants from the Gulf region back into Ethiopia. And then we'll be joined as well by a colleague from UNHCR, Anchinesh Bekure, who is leading the work on reintegration, is the focal person for the development of the guidelines that were mentioned by Natalia and that are going to be published shortly. So we're going to also explore with her the specificities of UNHCR's role and mandate when it comes to reintegration of former refugees, their specific approach, and their experience in targeting this particular group of returnees. So this is a bit the plan for the rest of the week, and Natalia is now back. Fantastic. Joining the meeting still. And then, as we mentioned, to close a bit this reflection on the policy cycle, we're going to be looking at monitoring and evaluation in a little bit more detail at the start of next week. So, Natalia, thank you for coming back. If you can hear us, And you would like to maybe just conclude your inputs on the issue of funding models and so on. We'll be happy to still hear from you.
Yes, I'm sorry, but I had a problem with the internet connection.
No
Yes, so
worries.
there was the question that I was answering about the long-term reintegration and how do we know who is reintegrating long-term. So my point was that it is very important to have early profiling of the returnees, where you collect information not only on their socio-demographic profile, but also on their intentions, because as we said, there will be those who would like to stay and those who are gonna to engage in circular movements. So, I mean, if your migration policy is really targeting the issue of how migration is fostering the development of the origin country, actually having this profiling is really key in order to be able to give targeted measures for those who are going to stay, but also for those who are going to go abroad. I mean, in the end of the day, this is what is really gonna to affect the cost effectiveness and the impactfulness of the measures that are gonna to be implemented. So early targeting and profiling of the returnees is really key in order to address adequately the measures and ensure that, for example, those who are reintegrating long term are gonna to be supported in an adequate way. I mean, in a lot of the situations where we had the return due to force majeure situations, this was not possible. But if you have a dedicated policy, this is really a chance to address the different needs of the returnees. And as I said, help effectively both groups, those who are staying and those who are involved in repeated movements.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for wrapping this up. I'm mindful of the time, but also looking at the keeping an eye on the chat and on the Sophie saying thank you very much, and thank you, Sophie, also for raising the point. I think your questions, and I'm saying this to all participants, your questions are what really allows us to go a little bit more in depth and sometimes to branch out also and look at things that weren't potentially necessarily included already in the initial presentation. I don't have any other raised hands at the moment. I don't have any other questions in the chat. So let me say a big thank you, Natalia, for joining us today. Thank you to all of you all of the colleagues who participated and engaged with their responses to our questions and with posing their questions. It's always an interesting exercise for us to engage in this discussion and a learning opportunity for us as well, I would say. We will reconvene on Thursday, 10 a.m. as usual. The eCampus page for this week is officially open and online with the required readings. Potentially some suggested reading material will be added over the course of the week, so keep an eye on that. Let me encourage you once again to start working on your group assignments to make sure that this exercise can also be as meaningful as possible. And in case you have any follow-up questions or need any support, we're always here at your disposal. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a lovely rest of the week. See you on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. See you, colleagues.